What's up everybody and welcome to yet another tutorial. This is a very requested tutorial and it is of course the car tutorial series part 2. In the first car tutorial we covered the rigid body simulation and the particle systems and shape keys. But something tells me that you're gonna find this one way more interesting, because we're of course gonna cover the explosions and the animated materials. So the plan of today is pretty straightforward. Chapter 1 is gonna be about the explosions and chapter 2 is the keyframe materials. Let's get started. Let's start by opening up a new project just to keep everything manageable. Then you want to delete everything that is currently in the scene. Press Shift A and add in a sphere. In this tutorial we'll be working with the sphere, but it's worth noticing that depending on your emitter object you will get a different simulation. So if you don't get an explosion that you like, you might want to change the shape of your emitter object. We will use particles to guide our explosion, so go under the particle tab and add in a particle system. Rename it smoke_guide. By default our particle system looks like this. It is just pouring out particles, and this is not what we want. First of all, change the number to 200. An explosion doesn't last that long, so we only want our particles to appear for a short amount of time. Therefore we want to change the frame start to something random like 5 and then move 4 frames ahead, so we only want our particles to be active for 4 frames. So I'll set the end frame to 9. And as you can see, we are now getting a small burst that falls to the ground. But let's give it some more power. So go under the velocity tab and change the normal to around 24. This will give the particles way more power. And as you can see, it kinda looks like an explosion already. I do think the lifetime of the particles is too high, so set it to something like 5 and set the lifetime randomness to something like 0.65. Now go under the source and change it from jitter to random. Set the randomize to around 14 and the object velocity to 1. I think this looks perfect. So go under the physics tab and add in a fluid physics. Change it from none to flow. Change it from smoke to fire and geometry to inflow. Set the sampling substeps to around 25. Go under flow source and change it from mesh to particle system and pick the particle system that we have created. Set the size to around 2 and check the box initial velocity. Now we want to add in our domain, so press Shift A and add in a cube. Scale it up quite a bit. Let's rename it domain and rename the sphere smoke plus fire. Select the domain and under the physics tab add in a fluid physics. Change the type to domain. Change the resolution to around 64 for now, but we're gonna change it later. Check the box adaptive domain and under the time steps maximum change it to 8 and the minimum to 2. Under the adaptive domain setting, set the add resolution to 25 and change the threshold to 0.01. In the gas tab, change the buoyancy density to 0.2 and the heat to 0.2 as well. This determines how fast the smoke will be rising. And change the vorticity to 0.01. Enable noise and leave the settings by default for now. Under the fire tab, change the flame smoke to 3 and leave the rest of the settings. Under the cache, set the end frame to around 100, but we're gonna change it to match our timeline later. Change the type to modular and remember to check the box resumable, otherwise we can't use the noise. Now let's try to give this a bake. This might take a while if you have a slow computer. If we want to play the animation now, nothing will happen, and this is because we also need to bake the noise. Or you can turn off the noise and then you will be able to see the result, but I'm gonna bake the noise for now, and we're gonna wait again. And done. Let's take a look at the simulation. Well, I think this looks very good. So what we want to do now is copy it over to our car scene. So open up the car scene, copy the explosion and the domain, and paste it over to your project. Now we just have to tweak some settings and then we're basically done. With both our smoke, fire and domain selected, press M and create a new collection. Rename it smoke plus fire. Right now a lot of things are wrong. The timing is wrong and the explosion is too huge. So let's start by scaling down the sphere and place it accordingly to where the car hits the rock. Under the physics tab of our domain cube, just free the data that we just baked. Scale and move the domain cube so it fits the scene. Think of it as a bounding box. Fire and smoke will only appear inside the box. So where should the box be? That is up to you. Now let's do something about the timing of the explosion, because right now it's not set correctly. We want the particles to appear at the same time the car hits the rock. So go down to the timeline and scroll over to the frame where the car hits the rock. Remember that frame. Go to the particle system of our emitter and change the start frame to that frame. Move 4 frames ahead, which in my case would be 29, since my start frame is 25. This might not be the same for your scene, so find the frame where your car hits the rock. And as you can see, the particles are now emitting when the car hits the rock. We are almost ready to bake, but we still need to change a few settings. Select our sphere and go under the physics tab. Under the flow source, we need to keyframe the size. And here's how you do it. Go to the frame where the car hits the rock. Then you want to hover your mouse over the size and press I. This will place a keyframe. Move 1 frame ahead and change the size to 1.5. Press I again and set another keyframe. Move 1 frame ahead and change the size the last time to 1. Press I and set the last keyframe. This will make the explosion huge in the beginning and then slowly get smaller. If you want the car to be affected by the smoke simulation, simply select the car, go into the physics tab and add in a fluid physics. Change the type to effector, set the sampling substeps to 15 and the surface thickness to 0.1. We are now ready to bake, but before we do that, it's very important that you have made sure that all the settings are set correctly, because it's very sad to start a bake that you then have to cancel later because you've made a mistake, because this is gonna take a lot of time and it will just be wasted time if you have to cancel it. So some important settings are the resolution division. I'm gonna set mine to 196. I think this works in a lot of cases, and if your computer is slow, I think it's a good number. Also, I'm gonna set the noise upres factor to 3. This might be too much for your computer, and you can also just set it to 2. Of course, you can test out if your computer can handle it, otherwise just set it to 2, it's fine. Now let's bake that simulation. And done. Let's take a look at the result. I think this looks awesome, so let's add a material to the explosion. Well, before I added in the material to my explosion, I built up all the scenery. I did this because this often changes the lighting, which will change the look of my explosion in the end. So I wanted to match my material to the scene around. This is my workflow and how I like to do it. Of course, you don't need to build up the scenery to follow along the tutorial. This is not an environment tutorial, and I have not changed any of the simulations, so the only thing that is different from my scene is the fact that I've added in trees, a bridge and a road. If you think this scene looks awesome and you want to play around with it, you can get this scene if you become a Patreon for only $2. But let's make that material. Select the domain and go under the shading tab. Add a new material. Rename it smoke plus fire. Jump over to cycle so we can see what is going on. Delete the principled shader. Press Shift A and add in a principled volume shader instead. Remember to connect it to the volume socket and not the surface socket, otherwise you won't be able to see what is going on. Nothing is really happening right now, and this is because the density is set too low. So if we set it to something like 50, you would be able to see the smoke. But just leave it by default because we're gonna change it using nodes. So press Shift A and add in an attribute node. Where it says name, type in density. Connect the color output of the attribute node to the color input of the principled volume shader. Then you want to press Shift A and add in a color ramp. Place the color ramp in between. Changing the parameters in the color ramp will determine the color of our smoke. We'll get back to this. Press Shift A and add in a math node. We're going to change the type from add to multiply. Select it and press Shift D to duplicate it. This is not a node tutorial, but if you would like to learn more about nodes, I will recommend watching CG Matters course on it, or if you want me to make a course in it, please write it in the comments. So plug in the factor of the attribute node into the multiply node. Connect the two multiply nodes and plug all of it into the density. Then you want to press Shift A and add in a Fresnel node. Plug it into the first multiply node. Then you want to duplicate another multiply node, and by changing the values of the two multiply nodes, we can make the smoke appear. The higher the numbers, the thicker the density. And you might want to play around with these numbers for a while until you get some smoke that you're happy with. I'm gonna leave my final settings after we're done with the node setup. Now we want to give the smoke some color variation. So by holding down Control and left clicking on the color ramp, we can add in some different colors. I want to change the two brightest colors to a more orange-brown color. I feel like this will give the smoke an appearance of being more dusty, which I really like. But this is a very artistic choice. You can do whatever you like. If you want to make the smoke green, then be my guest. You then want to press Shift A and add in another attribute node. This time you want to type in flame. Plug the color into the emission strength. Now we get this white glow, which is not what we want, but this is because the emission color is all white. So press Shift A and add in a black body. This will give the appearance of fire. Then we want to press Shift A and add in another math node, but this time we're going to change it to power. Then you want to press Shift A again and add in a gamma node. You can think of a gamma node as a brightness factor. I'm going to set it to 1.2. Then you want to duplicate another multiply node and put it in front of the gamma node. By changing the factor, we can change the brightness of the fire. Then you want to duplicate it once more, because now we want to create some variation. So add in another math node, but leave it at add. Then you want to duplicate the flame attribute, but change it from flame to temperature. Then you want to plug the temperature into the add node. And that is the final setup. If you're not quite happy with your result yet, the settings that you want to change are mainly the multiply nodes, the power node, and the color ramp to change the color. It should be pretty intuitive to play around with the density and the brightness of the flame, so go at it guys. A little quick tip before we continue with the animated materials. We used a particle system to guide our smoke simulation, but basically a particle system could emit anything. The only thing you have to do is go into the particle system and render as, change it from halo to object, and pick the object that you want to be emitted. You probably also want to change the lifetime of your particles to last a little bit longer. Other than that, we could emit sparks, rocks, books, pinches, I don't care. But sparks and rocks are probably best for the explosion. We are now done with chapter 1 where we covered the explosion, so let's move on to chapter 2, which is the animated materials. Go into the shading tab and with the car selected, pick the main body material, which is the brown car paint. If you're not sure how to locate it, just tap into edit mode and select a face which has the brown material assigned to it. This will automatically direct you over to the given material. Let's just quickly rename the material car body. To make everything more manageable, select all the nodes that are currently in our material and press Ctrl J. This will create a group. Rename it car main material. It's always a good idea to be organized. Now let's create the material that will appear when the car hits the rock. This is the material that is going to be under the car paint. So press Shift A and add in a principled BSDF. It could be any shader, but this is mainly for the example. If you want it to look like metal, you can just crank up the metal to 1, the roughness down to something like 0.1, and just leave the specular, that is fine. We want the grey metal material to appear when the car hits the rock. So how do we do this? With vertex paint. So with the car selected, go under the object data properties. And under the vertex colors dropdown, press on the plus icon to create a new vertex color. Rename it damage_1. Then you want to press Shift A and add in a vertex color. Pick the vertex color that we just created. Take the color output and plug it into the material output. In this way we can see the result. Change it from object mode to vertex paint mode. By default your object should be all white, but we don't want this. So change the color to a solid black. Press Shift K, this will automatically make your object the solid color that you have picked. Now change the color back to a solid white. We now want to paint on the places where we want a light metal material to appear. Vertex paint is based on how much geometry our model has, and since our model doesn't have that many vertices, we cannot make our paint job that detailed. But don't worry, we're gonna fix this procedurally later. So with the paint job done, plug in our car main material into the material output. Press Shift A and add in a mix node. Plug our vertex color into the factor of the mix node. Select both of the nodes, press Ctrl J and make it into a group. Rename it mask_1. Now take our car main material output and plug it into the top of the mix node. Take our light metal material and plug it into the lower socket of our mix node. Take the mix node output and plug it into our material output. Alright, we're getting somewhere. As you can see, the placement is completely right, and we have our light white material where the car gets affected by the rock. However, it looks very bad. It just looks like a solid color placed in the car. So let's give it some detail. Press Shift A and add in a mix node. Plug the white metal material into the lower socket of the mix node. Take our car main material and put it in the top socket of our mix node. Now we want to press Shift A and add in a Musgrave texture. If we try to plug the Musgrave texture into the material output, you can see that it's also just a black and white color, which we are going to use to create another mask. Plug the Musgrave texture into the factor of the mix node. Take the output of the mix node and plug it into the other mix node's lower socket. Select the Musgrave texture and the associated mix node. Press Ctrl J and make a group. Rename it mask 2. Now you want to take the mask 1 mix node and plug it into the material output. Let's just jump over to cycle so we can see what is going on. I actually think this looks pretty good. You can adjust the Musgrave texture if you want more or less detail. I think a scale of 20, a detail of 16 and a dimension of 0.3 worked great for me, but this might vary for your scene. Right now we can see both our car main material and the light metal. We only want the light metal to appear when the car hits the rock, so we need to animate it. So press Shift A and add in a new mix node. Place it right before the material output. Take our car main material and plug it into the lower socket of the mix node. By default, a mix node is mixing the two inputs 50-50. This means that we have 50% of the car main material and 50% of the car main material plus the light metal material. However, if we set it to 0, we only have the material with the damage, and at 1, it's the material without any damage. And since we can keyframe a mix node, we can decide when the damage should appear. So go to the frame right before the car collides with the rock. Set the factor of the mix node to 1, hover your mouse over the factor and press I. This will place a keyframe. Move 2 frames ahead. Set the factor to 0, hover your mouse over the factor and press I again to set the last keyframe. We now have our keyframe material. If your car hits the ground multiple times and you want different places of damage, you can just add in a new vertex color, paint the place where you want the damage to appear, and repeat the process with the nodes. If you're not quite sure how to layer the nodes, you can just slow down this part of the video and follow along. But I'm not gonna explain over it because it's basically the same process. Some of you might be thinking, damn, is vertex colors the easiest way to do this? And it probably isn't. You can probably do this all procedural, but I just really want to show you guys different techniques every video. So I really hope you enjoyed this input. Well guys, that was it for this video. I really hope you enjoyed this tutorial and learned some tips and tricks. If you have any questions, feel free to drop a comment in the comment section. Drop a like if you feel like it, and I'll see you in the next video.